Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I had a subscriber ask in the comments yesterday, and I'm like, you know what, I tried to answer him there, but I'm like, this is a really good video topic that I can help everyone to understand better. But he wanted to know, look, if half squats are bad for your knees, then what about push presses? Because a push press is oftentimes a half squat or a quarter squat before you do the overhead press, so isn't it bad for your knees? And the answer is going to be no, not so much. And the reason for that has to do with there's a dramatic difference there. So let me explain first why half squats are bad for your knees. Then we can go into why the push press isn't as big of a problem. All right. And this is, most coaches who've looked at this understand this. This is well understood in the strength and conditioning world. Now, you'll see researchers who don't understand this. You'll see researchers, well, we did this research and half squats seem to be okay for this and this, for muscle activation, but they don't get into the knee part because a lot of these researchers don't seem to have a good practical knowledge of actual what happens to athletes out in the field. But with half squats, you are coming down with a weight on your shoulders, usually a much heavier weight than you can actually squat full range of motion. And this has been observed by coaches over the years, and universally, coaches have noted that people who half squat are the people who later complain about squats hurt their knees. If you have a person who tells you that barbell squats, with a barbell, not a Smith machine, not a leg press, not a leg extension, that barbell squats hurt their knees or injured their knees almost every single time they're a half squatter or a quarter squatter. They don't go anywhere near all the way down. They don't even get within a foot of it. And the reason, what happens when you do a half squat, when you're at this angle right here where your femur is 45 degrees from your shin, right? When you're at this angle, that puts the most shear on the knee at that position right there. That joint angle is where the most potential for shear happens on the knee joint. When you half squat, because it's not a normal movement pattern, you have to come to a stop. You have to force yourself to stop there. In other words, you change your deceleration. And when a weight decelerates through a multi-joint movement, and a squat's a multi-joint movement, there's more than one joint involved. For those who don't know the difference, a curl is a single joint movement, right? Just your elbow bends. Unless you curl the way most guys curl at the gym, and then it's a full body exercise. But when you decelerate, you have to do something to put the brakes on. So what you see happen when people have a heavy weight on their back and they squat so that they can stop at 45 degrees for this half squat, because it's normal to be able to drop down. An actual squat, deep squat, is a normal function of the human body. That's actually a normal movement pattern that people do all over the world who don't live in first world countries. It's perfectly normal to sit around squatting. We squat to poop. We squat to do all sorts of things. It's normal. But when you come to that half rep, what happens for you to decelerate, you have to almost put the brakes on. And in order to stop that heavy weight from coming down, because it's too heavy for you usually, your knees have to jut forward, right? So this happens. The knee juts forward in order to bring the weight to a stop and stop it from decelerating on the way down. So what ends up happening when we talk about knees passing the toes a little bit is fine. Some knee slide is acceptable. In fact, some knee slide is even desirable to get ideal strength out of the bottom of a squat. But what happens on a half squat is that it tends to be over-exaggerated. And the problem we have is that it is over-exaggerated at the angle with the most shearing stress, and then we shear against the knee. Now, that wouldn't be so bad, other than here's what happens. If a person half squats 300 pounds, what's their max squat? 150, 200, right? Maybe 200 is the most they could actually go all the way down with. So because they're using a weight that's so much heavier than they're capable of doing for the actual normal body function, that deceleration requires them to push their knees further forward because it's a weight that is too heavy for them to handle for the normal body function. So what ends up happening, they get more knee slide than had they actually done a 1 rep max all the way down. because it's a heavier weight than their 1 rep max. Usually your 5 rep max for a half squat is more than you can squat all the way to the floor, ass to grass, or even to parallel. So again, to decelerate that weight that is way too heavy, you see that excessive knee slide. So it's that whole combination of factors that puts that shear on the knee. When you're doing a push press, let's go back and re-examine this. If a person can back squat 400 pounds normally, odds are, unless they have only trained their upper body for 5 years, then finally started squatting, your push press is going to be considerably less than your squat. In other words, a person who can squat 400, I bet you most of the time, their push press is going to be 250, right? Their half squat could be 500 or 600 though. Their half squat could be as high as 500 or 600 pounds. So imagine the difference here. That shear stress coming to a stop with 500 or 600 when it's more than your max versus the push press where you've only got at most maybe 250. So you're dealing with sub-maximal weights. In other words, a half squat is almost always done with a weight that's heavier than your true 1 rep max. Whereas in the push press is going to be a lighter weight than you can actually squat. It's pretty much unheard of for anybody to be able to push press what they can squat unless they're new to squatting. And the biomechanics are different. You also need to remember a push press has a totally different biomechanic and bar path. The push press that's racked in front of you, that changes a lot of things. That changes the whole movement pattern. And that can actually change even the amount of shear against the knee versus the back squat when you're having to try to bring that weight to a stop when it's pressing down on your back. Totally different. So again, a lot of it has to do with different biomechanics and more importantly, dramatically less weight. Because we'll go back to the point. 500 or 600 pounds will put more shearing stress on your knee than 250 will. And I'm using decently strong people there to describe it. If we go back to weaker people, we fall into the same situation. People say, well, a weaker person who can only squat, 200 and maybe they can only push press 125, that lighter weight, that 200 pounds, couldn't possibly put that damage on their knee. Well, yeah, it still can, and the reason is because they haven't built their connective tissue and joints up to handle real weight yet. In other words, if your deep squat is only 150 and you do a half squat with 200, that's still 50 pounds more than you're capable of doing for that normal movement pattern. It's probably 50 pounds more than you've built up the stability to handle correctly. And so it is still going to push you down, and it's going to push you forward more, bringing it to a stop. The inertia of it, bringing it to that short stop and everything is going to be just as much shearing stress relative to your work capacity and the strength that you've built your connective tissue and stabilizers and everything else up to handle is going to be still relative. So yeah, you could still damage your knees doing that. You could still damage your knees doing that. Obviously, it's a lower risk than with 500 or 600 pounds, but it still has to do with the relative strength because you build up that connective tissue over time with resistance. And again, it still tends to be relative to what you can lift. And we go back to the other point. Partials on big exercises hurt you. And again, it has to do with the fact usually that you're using a weight that's too heavy for you to put through the full range of motion. And then we run back to the same problem we run into with the bench press. If you're coming up short all the time and you're using a weight that's heavier than your max, what happens when you accidentally go too low one day when you haven't built the proper mobility and you haven't built yourself up to handle that heavy weight through the full range of motion? You just hit a heavier weight than your max and got forced into a range of motion you don't normally do. Things tend to tear like we saw with Jerry Ward, right? That's exactly what happens. Well, the same thing can also happen with a squat. Well, don't you think that can damage your knee? You accidentally squat 100 pounds too heavy because you've been doing half squats and it goes too low. Of course, you haven't built any strength mobility and you're still using more than your true max for that range of motion. So yeah, it can still cause things to snap, to tear, to shear, because you haven't built up your connective tissue to handle that load through that range of motion. So that's the other risk on top of it also. Then we go back to the push press. That won't happen because you're not going to be able to push press more than you can squat. It's just not realistic for anyone who does both exercises. Alright guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.